Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And housing. Let's move on to that. The government's housing bill, which starts being considered in the House of Lords this week, risks bringing about the end of social housing as we know it. Well, that according to Lord Kerslake, formerly the country's top civil servant. He now chairs the Peabody Housing Association and is leading a research project for the IPPR think tank on what the answers are. These are his thoughts.
After the Second World War, there was a major programme of public sector house building to improve the quality of housing for ordinary people. There was also a major private sector house building programme, and these two went together to see the highest levels of new housing supply that we'd seen for a long period. But today, London is in the midst of a full-scale housing crisis, with the prices to buy and to rent moving out of reach for ordinary Londoners. The housing bill, whilst it has some good things in it, is essentially focused on favouring one type of housing, home ownership, at the expense of another, social rented, thus ending the post-war consensus that we needed to build houses of all types in order to meet the different needs of Londoners. The housing bill opens up housing association properties to right to buy. The funding of the discounts for those right to buy properties will be paid for by forcing local authorities to sell their council stock when it becomes vacant. Because house prices in London are so high, it's likely that London will be funding over half of the cost of this new initiative. And in some boroughs, such as Westminster and Camden, it's possible that up to 2/3 of council houses will be forced to be sold. The government say they want to replace every council house sold with 2 new houses. However, the new houses are very unlikely to be in the same neighbourhoods as the houses that are sold, nor are they likely to be social rented. If they're one of the new starter homes, then the housing charity Shelter have said that you would need a salary of £77,000 and a deposit of £97,000 to buy one. That's not affordable for the majority of Londoners. When you combine these new policies, the extension of right to buy to housing associations, the forced sale of council properties to pay for the right to buy discounts, and changes in the way tenancies work for new tenants, and put that alongside the existing housing crisis, then I think ordinary Londoners are going to ask where the housing of the future is going to be for them.
Lord Kerslake there. I'm joined by Bill Davis from the think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research, working with Lord Kerslake on this project. Let's just bury down into this detail about how this might impact on London disproportionately. Because of the value of the homes, more might be sold. What the money from that will then be used to fund the policy up and down the land, or?
Yeah, that's right. There's a connection between right to buy voluntary deal for housing associations that needs to be funded effectively by selling off high value council homes. So in order to fund that policy, which is just at pilot stage at the moment, they will need to sell quite a lot of homes that are of high value. And we know where a lot of the high value homes are, and they're in London.
But we heard a figure there about 2/3, say, or a suggestion 2/3 in Westminster and Camden. We'll come on to our Westminster MPs in a minute, but that number isn't going to become vacant very quickly. 2/3 is an awful lot, isn't it? I mean,
yes, it is. I mean, 2/3 are technically in scope to be those kind of high-value properties that will be needed, but vacancy rates are actually really quite low, especially in high-value homes. And I think we need a lot of those high-value homes to keep down the housing benefit bill too. They will often be quite large and house families that would be extremely expensive to move into the private rented sector. So a lot of those properties are actually quite important for other reasons.
And what are the early signals if, as Lord Kerslake suggests, it's going to be very difficult to replace the one that you get rid of with 2? And if you do, certainly in the same area. So what's the outcome or the consequences of that potentially?
Well, the risks are quite high, obviously. I think we've seen from past programmes where homes have been sold, for instance, right to buy in the 80s, 90s and 2000s, that it's really difficult to replace those homes. Even if you get the kind of receipts that you need to be able to deliver those homes, by the time you've got around to delivering it, land prices in London are so high and rising so quickly that replacing that is going to be really, really difficult. So it's not just a kind of an issue of technically is the funding there, but it's also about the rising values of homes that just make it a lot more difficult to deliver.
Karen Butt, your thoughts on what the potential impact of this could be?
Well, it's a further downward spiral in the story of social housing. We've lost almost a half of the social housing stock in large parts of London over a long period of time. And as Bill has said, I mean, one of the immediate impacts of that is we're spending money on supporting low-income households in private sector housing, which is vastly more expensive. So you've got a housing benefit bill that soared up to £24 billion. Now, those two facts are completely related. If we see a further loss, and it won't happen overnight, either the right to buy in housing association properties or the high value homes being sold, but we will see a further backing up of families who simply can't afford to buy into a very high cost private rented sector, and the taxpayer ends up funding that. So it's a very, very foolish thing to do, and it does mean a huge number of people simply can't afford to buy at these kind of values, and they're just left stuck.
Well,
no, I think Karen's being overly negative on it. I think there's a lot of good in this housing and planning bill, but I do accept that there are some exceptions for central London. We have a very skewed housing market, become even more polarised in the time that Karen and I in the last decade and a half and more have been local MPs, between the very rich, and of course London is a global capital now, and those who are qualifying for social housing. And actually the biggest losers actually in our constituency are the private renters, people who have to rent and offer paying 3 times as much as people in social housing are for almost the self-same property. So I think we need to look at this whole aspect of intermediate housing, and the truth is quite a lot of housing associations have got no idea who's living in their stock in central London. I mean, there's a lot of illegal subletting that goes on that isn't an ideal situation either.
You're shaking your head.
No, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I mean, there's no evidence that it's on a massive scale.
Well, dare I say it, most of the providers, provided they get the money coming through the door, they don't ask any questions. And some of that money often comes from the housing benefit bill to which you referred as well, which is, again, part of the problem. It really is an absolute sort of mess that is in place. Listen, I mean, we're both parents of children, and, we look at the opportunities we had to buy property that, like many central Londoners think, how on earth are our children ever going to get onto the property ladder? I think it is right that the government are trying to address this in the housing and planning bill, but I do accept, I think there are some specific exceptions for bits of central London, and I'd like to see local authorities, perhaps throughout central London, in other words, not just on a one-by-one basis, but across the party political divide, being able to give some thought to how they make this work. And I think we'll see some of that in the House of Lords debates.
Again, moment of agreement. I mean, I think it's absolutely right that we address the issue of affordable home ownership as well as homes to rent. I mean, we are in a critical situation on both of those. I think there was some research done by Shelter last week that showed 9 out of 10 London parents fear that their children are not going to be able to find a home in London. But this housing bill, as Bob Kerslake showed in his film, is saying that affordable so-called homes to buy can be capped at £450,000. Now you need
that's
to
the upper
earn,
limit.
But in central London that's going to be what it comes in as, and probably in other parts too. You need to earn more than Mark and I do as members of Parliament to be able to afford to buy a home that is deemed by the government to be affordable.
You're saying yes,
it's
so
complete insanity.
What's the point of this starter homes thing then?
Yeah, no. Listen, I think we've got to do something. I mean, we can't simply say, well, the starter home initiative just won't apply to certain bits of the country. And I accept it's a very expensive part of the country in which to live, central London, and it's become a lot more expensive in the days gone by. But we've got to make a move somewhere along the line. But I think there needs to be some recognition within this legislation that the issues that face London, and particularly central London, are of a fundamentally different nature.
Do you think, would you, if you were honest, that in 10 years' time there'd be quite a considerably different composition in your borough, in your wards, in terms of housing and the housing stock?
I think it will be a little bit different. I mean, I'd be naive to suggest that there won't be some diminution in the social housing stock, but I think because a lot of it will be driven by availability coming up at a particular time, and I think across the party political divide, I don't think there's a sense that we don't want to have borough that is just made of the rich and perhaps even people who are letting property who are living overseas. I think that would be a very, very bad state of affairs, and I think we've got to try and clamp down on that.
But you've touched on one thing already. Of course, this process of selling council stock will happen quite slowly, and people won't necessarily notice it, will they? It'll happen over quite a long period.
Well, I'm just saying it won't happen overnight. I'm not saying that it'll happen slowly, because I think what is now happening, the London housing market is very different to what it was when Right to Buy was happening in the 80s and 90s. There is a lot of investor money out there, and what we know, one of the things we absolutely know, is that ex-Right to Buy properties, around a third of those in some boroughs, are now back in the private rented sector. Now, so what this doesn't actually help home ownership. What it does, it further fuels the minority who can afford either as companies or individuals who can afford to buy these properties, and then they let them back out at inflated
Let's bring
rents.
Bill in for a final thought about what you expect. The challenge of how we're going to solve this, where it's going to come from.
Well, there are loads of challenges across such a wide range of factors that there's no one silver bullet that's going to fix London's housing crisis. The London Housing Commission at the moment are considering a range of options, but what's clear is that we need the London housing market firing on all cylinders, but across all tenures too. So we need more social homes, we need more intermediate homes that people can buy and rent, but we also need more market homes too. But it has to come from a kind of range of policy measures across land, planning, construction capacity and new developers.
OK, well, we'll be looking at that in more detail in future.
Deliver all of those.
Oh, really?
Yes,
well,
indeed,
that's a whole nother
we
question,
do.
and no time to talk
We
about
do.
that today. Thanks
90
very much
days to
indeed.
go, for heaven's sake, yes.